So good evening. Tonight we're going to talk about the economics of strategy. And I think perhaps a more appropriate title for tonight's lecture would be Thinking Strategically. Because the idea is not to make you experts in strategy for tonight, because there's a full course on strategy. You can spend an entire semester, you can spend an entire year on strategy. This is within the overall managerial economics. How do you use the tools of economics to think strategically? And this is something that's going to be very important for you, but also something that's important for you as managers, but also as managers of your own. So there was a question about whether there's a class tonight because of fall break. Yeah, there is class, but if people aren't listening in, that's okay. We'll post it. We already missed one class because of the Labor Day, so I'm just going to post this lecture online, and people can get to it when they want. But that's okay. So we're going to continue here with economics and strategy on creating and capturing value. So if you recall what I just said a moment ago, the idea is not to make you experts on strategy, but to have you think strategically. And I've got really two takeaways that we'll see here. How to think strategically as a manager. So a lot of this will be acquired by experience, and a lot of this is going to be things that you'll look at more specifically when you take a strategy class. But I'm also going to encourage you with a lot of questions to think strategically about yourself, because what are you doing now? You are, good evening, come on in. You are all training to get a master's in business administration. And if you think about it, what are you doing over the span of 2 or 3 years but investing in your own human capital? That's primarily what you're doing. So as a takeaway from this class specifically, this tonight's lecture, but also for the class in general, what I'm going to encourage you to do is think of yourself as a product that you're developing. So how can you think strategically about yourself? And I'm going to encourage you to bring comments in during the class or through the chat or in person if you want. Ask questions about yourself, but I'm also going to ask questions of you, and I'm going to bring up a few points from my own life, questions that I have as I manage myself as a product, because I'm still learning. And I haven't given you the details because a lot of it is still pending an official vote from the UNC General Assembly in December, but I'm here as an endowed chair, which means I've got teaching responsibilities, but also research responsibilities, but also outreach responsibilities. And so part of what I need to do is to balance all three of those and figure out how one can complement the other. So what I do is I try to bring some of my own research into the classroom, but then I get questions from you, and then I try to write a paper out of that. And then in my outreach, I try to have the opportunity to present some of my papers so I can get some feedback. But I also need to figure out, and this is a question that I ask myself every day, how am I going to fill my day? Because as a professor, it's one of those things like owning your own business. You have to work 80 hours a week, but you get to choose which 80 hours. And so I'm very rarely tied to a meeting, very rarely tied to a schedule. But I need to produce 60 to 80 hours a week worth of stuff, whether it's class preparation, whether it's outreach, whether it's writing. Good evening, deep breath, take your time, no worries. And I often find that the thing that is most scarce for me is not time, but it's focus and energy. So there's always, and you probably find this too, you're rushing from a job to a class. Time is one thing, but it's also you wake up in the morning and you say to yourself, okay, I'm gonna work 10 hours today. What is the most important thing? How do I need to manage my energy? And then also I have to ask myself, how much do I want to spend on getting the urgent things done versus doing the important things versus developing my own human capital? So do I want to, if I'm at a conference, do I want to spend my time networking in the hallways, because that's where you get all the fun research ideas and opportunities? Do I want to spend my time in the sessions learning what other people are doing intellectually, or do I want to go to the teaching session? So I try to balance all of those things. And I was just thinking, I was invited to do, this doesn't affect the class, but on the 26th of this month, I'm going up to right outside of Richmond, Virginia, doing a panel on my book that came out about a year ago. And then I was invited to do a debate in Tallahassee on the 28th. And I was really excited, it was fun. And then I thought to myself, goodness, can I really afford another weekend away from home? Because I've got a lot of writing to do. I've got a paper I've got to finish by November 20th or so. I'm going to be on travel for about 10 days in early November, and I'll tell you all about that. And then the debate was canceled, and I was really happy because I can't do everything. So one of the things for tonight's class, I'm not going to ramble on too much about myself, is for you to ask yourselves, what product are you developing as product you? And how can you think strategically about you, yourself as a product, and how much time do you want to spend working? How much time do you want to spend investing in your own human capital and reading? What are your external constraints, etc.? So as a manager, you are not just managing your firm, you're also managing yourself. Where do you want to be in 10 years? Where do you want to be in 5 years? Where do you want to be in 20 years? What are your goals? And cost-benefit analysis, because this is the terrible beauty of economics, we all have an opportunity cost. You can't do everything. So you can't say, well, I want to retire by the age of 40, a millionaire, but I also want to work only 10 hours a week. It's not going to work doing both. Or I want to devote a lot of time to my family and raising my kids, but I also want to work late every night at the office. You're going to have to find a balance for yourself. Somebody suggested that I write on the plane. Yes, I do some of that too. I tend to read on the plane. So I don't want this lecture to be about me, but I'm going to use a lot of my own examples because I don't know you, but I'm going to invite you to think about certain things strategically. Next week, we're going to look at part 2 of strategy, which is how do you react to rivals? And that's going to be through a field of economics called game theory, which is basically looking at if you anticipate that a rival could act in a certain way, you're going to try to act accordingly and guess what the person's going to do. I'm going to try to bring in some video clips from a 1970s movie called The French Connection, which has some game theory in it, and The Princess Bride, that old classic. So tonight's lecture outline is going to start by thinking strategically. Then we're going to look at how to create value and how to capture it. And then 2 specifics on there, diversification and how to formulate strategy, and then a conclusion. So again, I know some of you at least have had the strategy class before. All of you will have it at some point. The purpose tonight is not to talk exhaustively about strategy because there's another class for that, but to start thinking in terms of how can you apply the tools of economics. And honestly, again, if you walk away from this class with 2 things, 1, think of everything using the tools of economics, specifically cost-benefit analysis and opportunity cost, and 2, think strategically. Mostly I will have done my job. So yeah, there's some details also when you think about demand and supply and production and organizational architecture, which will be the last unit of this class. But fundamentally, if you walk out of here thinking like economists and thinking strategically, I will have done my job. So what is strategy? You can think of it as the long-term policies to generate profits, not the day-to-day details, not the day-to-day management, but the long-term vision of what your business is trying to achieve and what your goals are and how you're going to operate within the marketplace. And as I said, it's going to apply to 2 things, your firm. So how are you going to use strategy to create value? What product are you going to offer? How are you going to serve the consumer? Because this is my romantic side. I really do think that business is romantic. Why? Well, because how do you get rich? You can get rich by stealing from people, but then you usually end up in jail. But the best way to get rich is to give people something that they want and sell it to them. Hi, Mr. Consumer, Miss Consumer, I'm going to make your life better, and you're going to reward me. So the only way really that you can make a lot of money is by serving people. Now, we'll see that there's some other ways that you can try to cheat and prevent others from doing business, and you can always go break their legs or make a campaign donation to a senator, but that's not cool. Good evening. But primarily, it's about serving the consumer. So how are you going to do that? How are you going to come up with a strategy? How are you going to implement it? And what kind of internal organizational architecture are you going to have to implement that strategy? So that'll be the entire last unit, is what kind of systems, what kind of formulas are you going to set up in your human resources, in attracting workers and getting decision rights and compensating people to implement your strategy? And you can think of that also for yourself. So you, right now, are investing in your human capital. You're getting a degree. There's no doubt about that. And there's a signaling value to the degree that's going to make you more attractive to consumers. But you're also stopping to think about things in a more systematic fashion. So what kind of architecture can you implement in your own life? And you can ask yourself things like, again, bringing it back to myself, I try to exercise first thing in the morning to get it out of the way, because by 9 or 10 o'clock at night, I've got other things on my mind rather than getting out of my house and going to the gym. So I want to do it first thing. I also try to read a novel a month in addition to my economics reading, but just to figure out what's, just to keep an open mind on that. I try to do 3 hours a day of research, and I find just blocking 3 hours a day of research and getting it done. I'll meet the deadlines in the afternoon, but it's really easy to get distracted from the research, so I try to do that right after exercising first thing in the morning. But then you can also ask yourself things like, do you want to go on retreat once a year? How important are vacations for rejuvenation? What kind of systems do you want to build into your life so that you don't have to think about certain basic activities? What kinds of trade-offs do you have between, so now might be a little bit more difficult, but after your MBA, when you earn more money, what types of things are you going to outsource in terms of production in your home? So are you going to buy a maid service, for example, so that you can focus a few extra hours a week on building your business? Are you going to, what kind of personal assistant are you going to hire if one is not given to you directly by your firm? For example, I had a professor suggest to us that if upon completing our PhDs and getting our first teaching job, if we were not given a research assistant to hire one, it costs about $1,000 a semester, and that keeps an undergraduate happy. But hire one. Now, there are certain things you can't do as a professor. You can't have your undergraduate research assistant grade for you. But you can have your undergraduate research assistant find books for you, download articles for you, do a basic literature survey. That comes out of pocket. But somebody once calculated that the net present value of one journal article for an economics professor is $10,000 over a career. So one doesn't really make a difference. But if you have 30 or 50, you're going to get promotions down the road, so it's a worthwhile investment. Something for you to think about in terms of what you're going to do internally and what you're going to outsource. Are you going to mow your own lawn because you enjoy it, or are you going to pay a high school student to do it for you? That's part of the strategic personal management that I want you to think about for yourselves, and even what kinds of things would you ask your personal assistant to do. My first job out of college was technically paralegal, but really I was the personal assistant to the managing partner of the office. So I would do his taxes, I would pick up his dry cleaning, I would do his legal research, I would set up meetings for him, etc. He outsourced all that so he wouldn't have, and I had everything but signature authority on his checkbook. So I would write out the check for him and clip it to the bill, and then he would sign it still. But I had all his passwords, all his accounts, and I made life easier for him so he could focus on billing. I think at the time he was billing $300 or $400 an hour, so he could focus on that. So something for you to think about. So I really like this framework for strategic planning from Chapter 8 of the textbook, so I've replicated it here because it comes back down to one of the basic lessons that we learned right at the beginning of the class. If you remember utility, how do you maximize your happiness? Well, you've got your happiness, and then you've got your budget constraint. You do as much as you can to make yourself happy within the constraint of reality. The isoquants and isocosts that we talked about briefly do the same thing. Well, if you're planning strategically, you have two things to think about, the internal and the external. Internally, what are your resources and capabilities? What can you do? What can you produce? What is your physical plant? What are the people who are working for you? Organizational capital, the process, the way of looking at it. And I'm sure a lot of you have stories about ways processes don't work. Academia is one of those places where a lot of things just don't work, but everybody's friendly about it and kind of joke. You may have heard the story, why are the fights in academia so big? Well, the fights are so big because the spoils are so small. But sometimes you ask yourself, why do I have to fill out 3 different forms? And I've worked for the private sector and for the government, and there always are processes that you have to follow. Well, look at your firm. What are your processes? Those are the things that you can control. On the other hand, the business environment you can't control, or largely you can't. If you elbow the competitors out, then suddenly you have pricing power. Well, then you're controlling the environment to an extent. But you can't really control who's going to come in and compete with you. Okay, again, you could have your enforcer go out and break their legs or burn down the factory. I highly recommend you not do that. You can also lobby the government to have an exclusive monopoly license. That's problematic also, but you can do that. But largely, you do not control your business environment. The markets for inputs, what are the prices of inputs? You're not going to control those. What are the outputs? You don't control that market. You don't control the existing technology that exists. Now, you may be one technology firm creating technology, but you don't control that. And you don't control regulation. Now, you can play jujitsu with the regulators and try to get better regulation for yourself or try to get exemptions for yourself, but you largely do not control that. So you take the two together. What is given? What is my reality? What is the business environment within which I'm operating, and what are my internal capabilities? Put those two together, I'm going to come up with a strategy and implement that through organizational architecture. So basically, all the class right here in one slide. Now, of course, we're going to unpackage all of those things. Now, for your personal lives, this might not work perfectly, but it's something to think about. What can you control and what can you not control? So in, I may have heard of Reinhold Niebuhr's prayer, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. I find that this is a very useful way of framing the world because you don't control your environment. You control your internal resources and capabilities. But as you try to decide how you're going to develop product you need to look at the environment within which you're operating. What are your constraints? What are your existing responsibilities to family or to friends or to your civil society or to your church or to your clubs? What is the reality? I might decide that I want to be a poet. I can be a poet, great, but I'm probably not going to earn a living being a poet. It's hard to do. Or I could decide I'm going to be a musician. Well, I better have a side income ready for that because the environment is such that I need to be realistic about those things. And I can control my internal resources and capabilities. One of the ways you're controlling yours is by being in an MBA program. But then you can also decide, are you going to focus in your MBA on getting good grades? Are you going to focus on reading as much as possible? Are you going to focus on networking as much as possible? How are you going to balance those things? From there, you can come up with a strategy to reach your goals in life. And those are probably going to shift over time. And one thing that I do that may be helpful to you is I try to have annual goals. And I break those down into semester goals, and I break those down into monthly goals. And then I'll try to break those down into weekly and daily goals so that everything fits in. And then if a friend is coming in from out of town, I can drop everything I'm doing and not work on a Thursday for the sake of argument and know that I've made enough progress on my weekly goals, and I'm going to finish working on Saturday or work all day Saturday, for example. But that also means that sometimes I'm just going to say no to a social opportunity. So I had friends who were going out on Friday night, and I decided not to join them because I wanted to finish working on a paper, which I submitted on Saturday afternoon. But that's because I had looked at my entire week as the big picture. And then what personal architecture are you going to devise? What kinds of systems? When are you going to work? Does it make more sense for you to block an entire day? If you don't have time to do that because you're working full time, does it make sense for you to grab 10 minutes here or 10 minutes there? That's for you to think about, but I wanted to bring that to your attention. Questions so far? It's just still pretty big picture stuff, but. Okay, so the first thing you need to do if you want to make money and be a successful business is you want to create value. And here's where I told you my romantic side comes out again. You are going to make money as a business by creating value for your company, but also by creating value for the consumer. So if you remember, the total value created by an industry is going to be the sum of the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. You bring something to the market and you sell it at the market price. Well, the difference between that market price and your production cost is going to be your producer surplus. And the difference between what the consumers were willing to pay and what they actually paid is going to be their consumer surplus. So when you bring a new product, say your Apple computer in 2008 or 9, and you have the brilliant idea that you're going to take a telephone and a desktop computer and a directory and a boombox and a video camera and a still camera and 10 other things, and you're going to lump them all together to a phone. You're going to make a lot of money because you were the first to do that. But you've also created value for the consumer, not just in terms of looking at pictures of cats on the internet. You know, it seems always skeptical about this. We have this great invention, more computing power in each one of our pockets than the entire Allied armies had in World War II. And we spend a lot of our time looking at cute pictures on the internet, but that's a different story. But think about the consumer surplus that you have extracted from the use of your cell phone. The fact that you can now not travel with 5 or 6 maps in the car. Up through about 5 years ago, I would always have maps in the car. I don't need maps. I've got a GPS now on my computer, and I don't need to buy a separate GPS. I can place orders. If I'm somewhere on the highway and I'm hungry and I don't want to eat at a fast food chain, I can plug into my computer good restaurants within 10 miles from here. That has created consumer surplus for me. And so part of that overall value that Apple created, later in the form of the Android type phones, but part of the value that Apple created goes to Apple, and part of it goes to the consumer. So this is where I say a successful firm does well by doing good. A successful firm will serve the consumer and profit from that by finding a product that the consumer does and by doing it better or cheaper. So we also need to look at then the fact that there's always actual and potential value. So in both cases, actual demand and actual supply are going to be less than what they could be. And why is that? Mostly because of transaction costs. So consumers are going to have some transaction cost, and if you recall, a transaction cost is a cost that is necessary for a business transaction to take place but is not captured in the price. So that could be search cost or transportation cost or driving half an hour to the store, learning about the product, negotiating the price of the product or negotiating a deal as you go along. And so one of the things that a business firm can do to increase value is to decrease that transaction cost and thus increase the demand. And we'll look at different ways. The most obvious one is the internet. So now I don't have to spend 25 minutes, 30 minutes in the car, going to the bookstore, spending 15 minutes in the bookstore looking for a book, finding that they don't have it, ordering it, coming back a week later, driving 20 minutes each way again to pick up the book at the bookstore. Now I simply zip on over to Amazon, whether I do it on my phone or my desktop computer. I order the product, I'm done. So the internet has reduced the transaction cost, thus increasing demand. Likewise, on the supply side, suppliers also face transaction costs, things like negotiating with their suppliers, negotiating with the consumers, finding attorney review of their documentation, compliance cost, accounting cost, etc. So one way that suppliers can create value is by decreasing their own transaction cost, thus increasing the supply. So there are 4 basic ways that firms can create value, and you see them here, they're pretty obvious. They can increase supply from lower production costs or lower transaction costs. Those are internal capabilities. Those are things that businesses control. Firms can increase the demand for their product through lower consumer transaction costs. They can also increase demand through other actions. The basic one, of course, is advertising and marketing. And then the final one is firms can introduce new goods and services. This is what Apple Computer did with the iPhone. If you look at your laptop computer there, I remember the first laptop computers in the early 1990s weighed about 1.5 tons. And then in the beginning, I have a keyboard here, but you've all got a desktop keyboard. The desktop keyboard does not have a place for your wrist to rest. And the early laptop computers didn't have that. And you used to have to plug a mouse into the side, a clunky mouse, until they realized, what about the mouse pad? Boom, creation of value through creation of a new product. Actually, if you get a chance, just for fun, you can go on the internet. There's pictures out there of everything that a cell phone does and what you used to have before smartphones. And it's an entire table full of stuff. You got your camera, your DVD player, etc. So the 4 ways that a firm can create value. It can lower its production cost or decrease the transaction cost. So there are a few ways of doing this. Using better technology is one way to do it. So if you're having a bunch of people doing things by hand and you can automate some of those functions, maybe you can start an assembly line. So in the early 20th century, the creation of the assembly line where each worker was able to specialize. This goes back to Adam Smith writing in 1776 about the early days of factory work, because it used to be that people before that time, the 1770s, people would mostly work in their own home, and create final products and then sell them. And the factory model was that you would bring all these people together and each one would have a specific function and get good at it and specialize. So it's more efficient in the production. Dell computers is a perfect example. So again, this is things that we take for granted now, but when I was in college last century, there basically were two kinds of computers. You had IBMs and Macs, and that was it. And then Dell computers started the revolution with the so-called IBM clones, and now you don't even think of them as clones because IBM doesn't make laptop computers anymore. But Dell started this with what I like to call a la carte production. And the secret of Dell's success was to ask each consumer what the consumer wanted and build a custom computer for the consumer, as opposed to building one size fits all. Walmart has been particularly good with integrating supply chains. That's another example. You can look at your organizational architecture. How do you motivate your workers? And we'll have an entire unit on this in a few weeks. Who has decision rights? What formula are you using internally? So do your workers have decision rights, or is everything centralized within the CEO? How do you compensate workers, bonus versus straight salary? So in all those cases, you can look at ways of decreasing your production costs and thus creating value, or you can lower your transaction costs with other ways, better contracting. Computers, again, the internet has done magnificent things about lowering transaction costs because it makes things a lot easier for consumers to compare prices, and then for you as a producer, it's easier to negotiate deals. There's so much more information that is readily available. The second way that a firm can increase demand is by lowering the transaction costs for consumers. Better accessibility in marketing for consumers. So if you think about even when you go to the grocery store, when you're happy at the grocery store and you find things, you're going to buy more stuff. So there's a whole art to grocery store placement. And of course, I'm the weirdo who actually likes to do this. I'll routinely look at the prices of things that are down low, where I have to squat down to see them. And I'll look at prices that are up high. And then the higher prices tend to be in the band of visibility. There's also what tends to be at the ends of the aisles. What have you noticed in grocery stores? What's that, sir? Impulse purchases. So the impulse purchases are not going to be buried. The impulse purchases are going to be brought forth, and generally they're the first thing you see when you walk into the store, or they're contained at the end. So there's a whole strategy to placement there. Internet purchases with the possibility of an in-store return. So how are you making the consumer's life easier? Buy it on the internet. You don't like it, you can return it at any Walmart, any Target, etc. Well, if you're already in the Target, what are you likely to do? Buy more stuff. And I forget who brought the example up. No, I think it was Judith last time. We talked about Walmart's guarantee that if Walmart, if you find a lower price somewhere else, you can bring it into any Walmart. Well, most people are not going to bother doing that. But they know that, so there's a happy feeling. But also, if they come back into the store, they're likely to buy something else while they're at it. One-stop shopping, Walmart and Target. I never go to Walmart or Target, except when I want to buy groceries and it's the most convenient place. But then suddenly, when I'm doing my groceries, I suddenly realize that my niece needs a present, and I realize that a new pair of shoes would be a good thing. And then why don't I buy a new video game also while I'm at it? Because they put it all together, and then those things become impulse purchases for me, but Target has been smart about that. The book mentions craft Lunchables. So instead of having to buy a pound of ham and a pound of cheese and a box of drinks and then preparing them and packaging them for your kid, you buy Lunchables, you pull them out. It's like the microwave dinners that have everything built into them. Convenience for consumers. FedEx and UPS labels that you can print. So suddenly you don't need to go to the post office, you don't need to go to UPS, and you've just saved yourself 20 minutes. Well, what has the firm done by creating that? You're going to tend to use the product more, and if you're not happy with the return, you just simply print out the sticker, slap it onto the box, and UPS or FedEx will come pick it up at your doorstep. So these are some of the basic examples of ways. And if at any point, if you want to chime in with examples of your own, go ahead and do so. But the idea here is to get you thinking about these kinds of things. Now, what other ways can businesses use to increase demand? The obvious way, marketing and advertising. You never knew you needed product X. And of course, they can, sometimes it's pretty direct. You just think, well, I don't know which product to choose. I've got 20 options. Oh yeah, but I saw that commercial. Let me try it once and see if I like it. And then 15 years later, I find that I magically still like the product and I just stuck with it. But that's effective advertising. Product quality and firm reputation. So I think it's REI, Recreation Equipment, has a lifetime guarantee in all the stuff that it sells. Now, of course, I bought a pair of hiking boots at REI, and I didn't know about this guarantee, and so I just went again and bought another pair of hiking boots, but that's the kind of thing that's going to generate goodwill over time. I noticed I bought some roach traps over the weekend. I guess that's a big thing around here. And there was, on the back of the box in the instructions, it said that if I was not perfectly satisfied with my purchase, I could return it by mail for a full refund. Now, I'm not going to clip that and put it in the mail for a $4.50 refund. But that's kind of nice to know that it's out there. So that product is creating a quality reputation. There's a really fascinating case study in the textbook about the Serbian McDonald's during the 1999 NATO bombing campaign, where McDonald's was associated with the US and there were riots against McDonald's, and McDonald's marketed a Serbian burger, complete with a Serbian flag or the Serbian hat, and suddenly it became, they appropriated it as their own and disentangled it from NATO or from the US and were able to sell. McDonald's is good about doing things like that and having the core product, so they know what their core product is, but then they'll change things slightly country by country, and you can have, like France, you can go into a McDonald's and buy a beer. Or they'll have one particular sandwich that responds. So McDonald's in India has a whole line that is non-beef because a large proportion of the population doesn't eat beef. So they serve something else, but it's still the McDonald's image. So they're trying to enhance the reputation for quality and for responsiveness to consumers. We were talking about, next, I'm sorry, is the lower the price of compliments. You can do this through diversification or joint ventures. Hewlett-Packard with its Inc. program, which I probably need to get into at some point. But now that it's no longer a separate product, if they can lower the price of the complements, people are more likely to buy a home printer because ink's not as crazy expensive as it used to be. Gillette has been particularly good with this, and I don't want to go too far and share my annoyances with you, but one of the things I don't like is when things are locked up in grocery stores. I've mentioned this already, and buying a Gillette razor is practically free. But the razor blades cost something like $5 or $6 per blade, and they're locked up because they're so expensive, people can steal them easily. But Gillette has done a good job of having the match between the two. And then there's so many different kinds of razors, you'd think there'd only be one. No, there are multiple kinds. People develop a brand loyalty, etc. We'll talk about diversification and joint ventures. And then the last point on this, other ways to increase demand, is blocking lower price substitutes. So one way you can do that is through private barriers to entry. You can have no outside food or drink is a typical one. So movie theaters, for example, what are they trying to do? Well, they're trying to make sure that they can sell their own product at a higher price rather than having you bring in your own snack into the movie theater. You can lobby government for barriers to entry, and I'm going to try not to spend 10 hours talking about this, but this is a particular area of research. Taxi companies will routinely do this. So Austin, Texas, I mentioned, and a few other places. Spain and Germany have banned Uber in the name of public safety because the drivers don't go through a background check. But we all know what's really going on. It's, pardon me, the taxi companies that were able to capture the political process. Cable monopolies, barber licensing requirements. The price of sugar in the US today is about twice as high as the world price because the American sugar industry has been able to lobby to restrict other entrants, specifically from the rest of the world. In Wisconsin, up until about 15 years ago, margarine had to be pink, dyed pink. Well, think about why would that be? It's a big dairy state. Dairy doesn't want competition for butter from margarine, so you pass a law saying that it has to be pink. Why? Well, consumer safety. We don't want the consumer to mistake margarine for butter, and then suddenly you make it more complicated. Nobody wants to put pink margarine on a piece of bread. Florida had a case recently with farms selling raw milk to people. And some people tout the health benefits of raw milk. I used to drink raw milk when I was a kid, straight from the farm. Never had a problem, never got sick. But instead of letting consumers decide, and some people think it's healthier for you because it builds up immunity. Some people don't think it's healthy because they want their milk pasteurized. But instead of letting consumers decide, there's a law in Florida that says that milk has to have vitamin D added and it has to be pasteurized. Otherwise, it's not milk. So milk that comes straight from the cow is not legally milk in Florida. It has to be called unpasteurized milk product. But that's still a victory for the producers over not being allowed to produce it at all. So one way that you can increase demand for your goods is by lobbying the government for barriers to entry to your own good. And then the final way is strategic pricing, but we've already talked about strategic pricing, so I'm not going to mention that. And then we talked about the introduction of new goods and services. We all take it for granted now that computers are cheap. That is, we can all afford them. But again, back to my days in college, and I went to college in the early 1990s, I did not have my own computer in college. I went to the computer lab, and it closed from midnight to 8, so I was forced to go back home and get some sleep and edit my work, and then go back in the next morning. But it's just kind of obvious. And then I remember getting my first desktop computer so I could work more efficiently at home. And it never crossed my mind to get a laptop in the beginning because I didn't want to spend that much money. And suddenly the laptop became cheaper. Is that a tablet or a laptop that you've got there? It's a tablet. And then you get the tablet that's even smaller. And a cell phone. I'm a late adopter of technology. I don't spend a lot of money on gadgets, but I remember when cell phones first came out, I thought, yeah, I guess it's kind of nice for travel. And then now everybody has cell phones because the price has gone down so dramatically. So those are examples in the case of Apple of being there first. And then in other cases of being there better. How can you innovate? How can you convince people to get your product? How can you incorporate technology? And it just seems so obvious. I remember reading a spy novel at some point in the late 1980s, and some person had a big phone, a wireless phone that had a GPS in it. And I thought, wow, someday maybe we'll have that. And now we actually have video conferencing, Skype we take for granted, through Zoom. This evening, this is just the kind of stuff that we now take for granted. But those were all technological innovations. Apple iTunes was another example. So I remember thinking when I first started lecturing, I could not talk about vinyl because students would not know what a 33 or a 45 RPM record was. Apparently vinyl's making a comeback with the hipsters now. But then I would start talking about, so when you go out and buy your CDs, and students would look at me and say, we don't buy CDs, we download music. And I just sold half and donated the other half of all the CDs that I acquired over the last 20 years because I'm on Spotify now. And I know whenever I moved, I would have 20 boxes of CDs. So I sold them, donated the ones that I couldn't sell, and now I just have Spotify so I can listen to all the music that I want on my computer without having to lug 20 boxes wherever I go, and it takes up a lot of room. But lug the boxes? No, it was a choice that I made. When VCRs first came out, you could have your own movies. And I remember, you still have your VCR? Does it blink noon, or have you been able to program the time?
I haven't plugged it in a while.
Okay.
And I have my DVD player and the Blu-ray DVD player.
Yeah.
Still have my mind when I was a little girl.
So you still have all the old technology. Yes. Good, good, good.
Love my mind. I do. I get
well,
excited.
Vinyl does have a certain warm quality to it, and I like the cracks and pops, but it's heavy. And even I remember when VCRs first came out, and I would record things off the TV. You're not supposed to do that, but then you'd have the movie, and you could watch it again. You'd go to the video store, and then you get a $100 fine if you didn't rewind your tape. I don't know if you remember those days. And then they had a new thing that came out. I think it was the laser disc. It was the size of a 33 RPM.
My friends had that.
But it never caught. But then DVDs caught. And then you had Blu-ray, and it seemed like within a year or two of Blu-ray coming out, you were able to stream things. And now Netflix is what, $10 a month, maybe?
Yes, 10, I can tell you.
And then you have Amazon Prime that you can get for free if you have a .edu address, and you can download a lot of things for free off Amazon Prime. But they're also good because there's some things you can get for free and other things you have to pay for. And I used to never pay for stuff, but now that they've gotten me used to the convenience, if I've watched the first season of something and the second season costs $25, I'll just shell out, and I don't even need to enter my credit card number. See, they've reduced the consumer transaction cost. So with just one click, I automatically download the next season of whatever it is I'm watching. Boom, $25 out of my pocket and into their pocket. I'm happy because I don't have to wait an entire. It used to be torture. You ever watch the show 24? Action-packed thriller takes place over 24 hours, so 24 weeks. They would have one show a week, and each one was an hour. It was awful. We'd get together in graduate school, watch it for an hour, and then you'd have to wait 1069 for a month of Netflix. You'd have to wait an entire week before you could watch another episode of 24. So then, with technology, you could just sit down and binge watch 10 episodes and then go about your day and do something else. So those are examples of introduction of new goods and services. And then a few final things in other considerations to create value. You can engage in a joint venture or research cooperation with other companies, even competitors. Because research is so expensive, you can all get in on it together and pool your money together for research, and then you all benefit at a fraction of the cost. Or you can engage in a joint venture. So some companies will do this. General Motors found that it was difficult to break into the Chinese market, so they started a joint venture with a local auto manufacturer. Sony, same thing, was not able to sell its video games in China, so it partnered with a group called Shanghai Oriental Pearl Group, had a joint venture, and they were able to break into that Chinese market. I'm going to get this wrong, but is it Coke and McDonald's and Pepsi and Burger King? Or something like that? It would kind of make sense that you'd go into a McDonald's and you could have either Pepsi or Coke, but they've marketed them together as a joint venture for that. There's an example in the textbook about Kodak and Fuji partnering with Canon, Minolta, and Nikon to create a new advanced photo system in the 1990s. Ericsson, the Swedish mobile phone manufacturer, partnered with Sony, and this just simply decided we're going to make mobile phones together. NBC, Disney, and News Corporation created Hulu. We were talking about downloading movies. Disney now has its own, so Disney used to make only animated films until about, what, 10, 15 years ago. Now there's Disney-owned Star Wars. So Disney actually makes its own movies. And then MSNBC is an easy one, MSNBC. From 1996 to 2005, there was a joint venture between NBC and Microsoft, and it kind of made sense for them to produce together as MSNBC. Then Microsoft pulled out of that. And then there's Google, and I don't understand Google, because it seems Google used to be a search engine, but now Google's working on driverless cars, Google's working on email, it does a bazillion things. I don't really understand how Google creates value, but I think its parent company is the single biggest company, I think, in the US. I could be wrong on that. Alphabet, thank you. Then there's the question, how do you convert your organizational knowledge into value? I talked about the importance. This is just a snapshot because we're going to have a full 4-lecture unit on organizational architecture and organizational knowledge. If you take all your assets, the tangible assets, the capital, property, the things you can touch, the plant, the equipment, add to that the intangible assets like patents or trademarks, the reputation, the supplier network, put it into that, the human assets, the management that you have, the human capital that you've acquired, the procedures that you've put together. All of that is what makes your firm unique. How do you translate that into value? How do you leverage it into value? And we'll talk about that at greater length. And then finally, of course, new technology. As an entrepreneur, as a manager, you want to be on the lookout for potential competitors. This is your SWOT analysis that I'm sure you've heard of a million times, your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Who are your potential consumers? What is going to be the next big thing in the market? So I probably brought this example up before, but the digital camera was actually invented by Kodak Film Company as early as the 1970s. But they were all chemical engineers, and they looked at this and thought, this is really cool, but who's going to buy that? So they put it in the basement. 20, 30 years later, everybody was buying digital cameras. In fact, today, very few people buy digital cameras because the camera's incorporated in your phone. and the optics have gotten so good that you don't really need a separate camera. Okay, this again, I'm going to be a dinosaur, but I remember the transition from film cameras to digital cameras and how cool. But it was always a pain to get the pictures off the digital camera because you had a little tiny little card, and how are you going to integrate that with the computer? Now, cell phone, problem solved. I've got my little, I visited my nieces recently and they gave me stickers. So I've got 7-year-old and 9-year-old stickers on the back of my phone. That's okay. Always take your work seriously, never take yourself seriously. So new ideas. As a manager, you always need to be on the lookout for new ideas. And I'm not in a position to teach it, but I think it would be really neat if it doesn't exist to have a time management class for MBAs, because that's one of the most important things you're going to do. I read once that you should divide, or one suggestion is divide all your tasks into A, B, C categories. A is the very important, the urgent, the necessary. B is the important, and C is the secondary. Throw out all the C's, and then the time that you would have spent on the C tasks, read or think about how you could do things differently. Now, I don't know if that's the best way of doing things, but that general idea that as a manager, you need to be constantly on the lookout for better ways of doing things, for ways of improvement, because the market is going to zip past you otherwise. Questions before we look at the next step of capturing value? See, I told you that upon walking into this class, I felt like I wanted to curl up under a blanket and read a novel because of the rain. And then suddenly I got really excited. I'm trying not to talk too fast because I like this stuff so much. Yes?
To capture value in the other category, when companies create consumer involvement in product development, like when McDonald's did the competition for chefs, and whatever the top 3 chefs won, those 3 hamburgers are going to be part of the McDonald's menu. When a consumer can like a competition, it's like sketch arts competition, then it becomes a logo.
Yeah, so the question was, what about consumer involvement in new product development, like a competition that McDonald's had with chefs, and then the top 3 burgers were chosen? I would put that under the label of product quality and firm reputation, so or marketing advertising. You're getting consumers excited about your product by giving them the opportunity to feel like they're part of it. There's a competition, there's a buzz, everybody's excited about it. You want to buy that product. Oh, Doritos halftime Super Bowl, all the marketing things, exactly, yeah, that you associate. And Doritos are addictive anyway. So, okay, so you've created value. Congratulations. Now, 2 challenges. You have to capture it somehow, and you've got to keep it from competitors, because otherwise, as we know, in the competitive dynamic market, unless there are what? Barriers to entry, other people are going to try to come in and compete your economic profits away. So people are always on the lookout. And it could be from reading, or it could simply be from, hey, firm X is doing this. We have the capability of doing that. We just never thought about it. Let's hop in on that. So one of the things that a firm's going to want to do to capture the value it's creating is to try to establish market power. And it's also going to try to get superior factors of production so it can produce more effectively. So we've already looked at pricing. We looked at what you do strategically, how you can set different prices through price discrimination, through segmentation of the market if you have market value. So we've already covered that. But the question is then, how do you establish market power in the first place? So you can look at a threat analysis. Who are your rivals and potential rivals, and how do you anticipate their actions? We'll talk about that next week with game theory. There's a parenthesis I need to close. I apologize. Be aware of your substitutes, including technological innovation, what's going on in the market. So if you are the top typewriter producer in 1950, you might think to yourself, aha, we've entered the era of basic electronics. Maybe I can do something differently with electric typewriters. The IBM Daisy wheel was an example of that. It was a technological innovation because it no longer had the branches. But if you're a typewriter manufacturer in the late 1980s, early 1990s, you better realize that people aren't going to be buying your typewriters for very long. So you need to think about what the next step is going to be. Power analysis of buyers and suppliers, and then the cost-benefit analysis, CBA, cost-benefit analysis of using government. It's always going to be a temptation to reach out and use the power of government to block competition by getting a special favor, by having exemptions written for yourself under the law. I'm always amused by these things, and stop me if I already mentioned this, but restaurants in town are not allowed to serve alcohol past a certain time unless they also serve prepared food. And the definition of prepared food is simply that they have to have prepared it, so they can't just pull a slice of pie from the refrigerator. If they drizzle chocolate on it, that's considered to be prepared. Past a certain time. I don't know about locally, but I remember when I was in Utah before the Olympics. Yeah, so each state is going to have different rules, but Utah, before the Olympics, you couldn't buy a beer unless you were a member of a club. Now, what happened is you would go into a bar, and for $5, they would sell you a club membership, and then you were a member of the club, so you could go and then they would sell mixed drinks, had half a shot in them, and they would sell you the other half of the shot next to it, but you had to mix it yourself. The bartender couldn't do it for you. There's some places, for example, I think it's Atlanta, Georgia, you're not allowed to buy alcohol before noon on Sundays, and those are some of the remnants of the blue laws. Some places, they're still dry counties, some places in the US. So there's a whole other story behind that, of course, but I'm always fascinated by that because it's tempting. This is an ethical question you're going to have to ask yourselves, and you can probably guess how I feel about it because I'm bringing the question to you. The ethics of using government to block competition. I think it's dishonest. I think it's using violence to keep competitors out by using the political process. And if you're going to make a buck, go out there and compete. Provide it better, provide it cheaper, provide better customer service instead of saying, well, I'm going to call the cops on you. So something to think about. But there's a cost. Even if you want to look at it strictly from a positive economic perspective, you're going to have to pay up. You're going to have to make a campaign contribution if you want the senator or the regulator or the city council to move the law in your direction. And you're going to have your pound of flesh. To quote Shakespeare, they're going to extract their pound of flesh from you. Eventually, they're going to come to you asking for some sort of a favor in return. So that's something to think about. And then the regulation could go in an opposite direction. There's even a whole study of the strategy of regulation. So politicians will, I'm just going to say it, politicians will sell regulations to people, but politicians will threaten regulations against an industry so they can get their donation and then remove the regulation, or even just the threat. We might have to shut things down. So there's a whole lot more that's been written on this. I'm writing a book about this right now on cronyism, so I can get really excited about it. I'm just going to move on right now, but that's one way to establish market power. You can establish market power because you're the only one making that product. You're doing it better, you're doing it cheaper, etc. Or you can use government. That should be 3-2. Yes.
What do you feel though about that same concept applied towards like nonprofits that are doing more social cause?
About blocking people, or?
Yeah, about using regulations.
Can you give me an example, and then I'll repeat it for the.
Well, opposed to having a business that's doing something like for-profit, like grading things, rather than more like a nonprofit, like say a non-governmental fostering agency, right? I don't know who their for-profit competitors would be, but I'm just saying like an example, and then them using government to help keep out competition in the name of social justice rather than.
Okay. So the example is nonprofits using government to keep others out, and the rationale that they are engaging in a social justice function. I haven't. I'll do what good old public speaking. I'm going to take that question because I don't know the answer to it. I haven't quite understood nonprofits to the extent it makes sense if you're. Say, what is it, the Audubon Society or Rails to Trails Conservancy, that you'd be a nonprofit. But why would a hospital be a nonprofit as opposed to for-profit institution? So part of the idea is that the hospital is providing a service, that you don't want them competing and cutting costs. But on the other hand, all it means is that they're plowing their profits back into investment and back into salaries as opposed to shareholders. So there's still some sort of a profit motivation.
That's true.
So.
Claims to be nonprofit.
Which does?
Rolex.
Rolex, the
They claim to be nonprofit because they told all their
Yeah, so Rolex, but who are the investors? So even if Rolex watch plows all its profits back into into product creation, who are the investors? Is it a privately held company? Are they just bumping up their salaries? There's a million ways, and this is something that you as managers can think about, but we'll talk about it in the compensation part. You as a manager, and a lot of college presidents have this, or think tank presidents, for example, they'll make, quote unquote, only $300,000 a year, but then they have housing provided for them, and they have a $200,000 stipend, and they have a driver, and they have a car, and they have access to the company jet. But as far as taxes are concerned, they're only reporting $300,000 a year because they can compensate themselves in other ways.
People that are retired and they take $1 salary.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
So yeah, if you're retired, you take $1 salary, but you're also getting stock options for sitting on a board. So there are ways, and we'll look at that with compensation. There are ways that you can go around that and find ways to compensate yourself in other ways. A nice office, a retreat on 500 acres somewhere for corporate retreats, and the companies can get pretty creative at doing this kind of stuff. So you can also capture value through better factors of production. This obviously makes sense, right? So if you have better workers, if you have better managers, if you have a better process, if you have better capital, you're going to capture value. But the trick here is economic profits tend to go to the asset itself, thus raising its price. So if you're a really good manager and you're increasing the value of your company, other companies are going to try to poach you. So either the other company is going to get you and pay you a higher salary to attract you away, or your current employer is going to have to raise your salary. So you're more productive, but your price has just gone up. If you have a machine that's more efficient, somebody else might want to buy that machine for you at a higher price. So economic profits are going to go to the asset rather than to the production for the business. So that's going to be a tricky part of how to integrate more productive assets, because, as we've seen before, normal economic profits are zero. So if you're temporarily making high economic profits, positive economic profits above the opportunity cost, the price of your assets is eventually going to be bid up in the market such that you're going to lose your economic profit and go back to normal economic profits. And then the last thing to keep in mind in this is don't forget the opportunity cost. There might come a point where, hypothetically, your machine is adding an extra $100,000 per year in value for your company, but you could sell it to somebody else for $10 million because that person has a more effective way of using it. So you're actually losing money and an economic loss by continuing production if the value of your assets goes up. Then the second part of this is the combination of things. So we looked at the individual assets. The whole can be greater than the sum of the parts. That is, you can have a combination of assets that works really well together. Your capital, your processes, your organization, and we're going to talk about this more during the organizational architecture part. But you may have a competitive advantage over your rivals because your assets work particularly well together. You have put together a well-oiled machine such that your workers and your capital and your processes are so good at working together that you've got a competitive advantage. A competitor could poach away your workers or could adopt your organizational architecture or your recipe, but is not going to be able to take away from you the entire team that you have put together, and that is the team of the combination of assets. So it's going to be difficult to replicate that, and as we're going to see in so many cases, that could be the result of foresight, because you're so good, you put together the perfect management team, the perfect capital to labor combination, the perfect organizational process, the perfect production recipe, or it could just be good luck. And there's a huge element of good luck and bad luck and timing in all of these things. And that's all I'm going to say about it for now, because this ties in with organizational architecture, which is an entire portion of this class of how to put together an organization to maximize your value. You can read on your own the Walmart case study. So we've been at this for about an hour. I think I've got about another 20 to 30 minutes of material. Do you want to continue? Do you want to take a brief break now? What is your preference? Maybe another half hour or so. You want a break? Okay, let's take a 10-minute break. We will reconvene at 7:10. So.
By the way, but what you did post about the homework, the input output for 5 on module 1.
Yeah. Oh, good. Good. So we're going to continue now. I'll let you read the Chapter 8 Walmart case study in the middle of it, and then the question at the end. You can read that more effectively than my sitting up here. I'm not going to photocopy it and put it on a PowerPoint. One of the things I'm looking at, so this is the first time I've taught the class, one of the things I'm looking at for the future is more case studies. And I'm tempted, I don't know if I'm going to do half textbook, half case study, or if I'm going to do all case studies in the future, but that's the kind of feedback I'd be curious in having from you as we go forward with that. Case studies, okay. Because there's some things you kind of need a textbook for, and then others, big picture conversation, but I'll come back to that as we go forward. I promised you I would put some sort of a rubric up for grading. I will have that by the end of this week. I apologize for not getting it done sooner. No sob stories, I'm just kind of busy right now. So I'm trying to focus, doing my best to be responsive to emails first and then posting things that's secondary. Conclusions on this. Capturing value. It's not something you do once and then you move on with your life. It's an ongoing process. Competitive advantage is unlikely to last. You might have found the right formula. Somebody else is going to borrow it from you. You might have found the great product, and then before you know it, technology has changed and your product is not interesting to consumers. Normal economic returns are what? Zero. They're called normal for a reason. That is, zero is the norm. It is very rare to capture positive economic profits because that means that your assets are earning more than their opportunity cost, which means either somebody else is going to try to compete with you or somebody else is going to bid your assets away, which is going to drive your production cost up if you try to keep them. Always be aware of your SWOT. So part of what you need to do as a manager is be aware of the world. In classes in the past, so I taught a money and banking class for undergraduates for several years, about 5 or 6 years. I had them read The Economist every week. It's my favorite magazine. And one of the things that I like is that unlike the Wall Street Journal, which is great, it's not going to take you 2 hours a day to read The Economist because the Wall Street Journal is so thick with so much information. I recommend to you that you read a weekly news magazine, not to become experts, but to know what questions to ask. So your boss says, hey, production vice president, because that's your new job 5 years from now, we're thinking of expanding into China. What do you think? So instead of being a deer in the headlights and thinking to yourself, I don't even know where to start, you're reading The Economist every week. You have a vague idea of what's going on in China. You know what questions to ask. You know what experts to tap into so you can answer the question. If you're at a cocktail party, and this has happened to me a few times because I'm not in finance, I'm a professor, I'm not in the news, most things that happen have no bearing on my research because I tend to look at institutional and cultural changes over 25 to 50 years. So if something changes in the world, it probably doesn't matter to me. I'm looking at big picture stuff. But I found myself at receptions and cocktail parties where people ask me, so what do you think of blah, blah, blah? And I have no idea what they're talking about, and it's very embarrassing. So I would recommend to you, as part of your personal strategy, know enough about what's going on in the world that you can, A, know what questions to ask should it come up, and B, not pull a Wenzel at a cocktail party. Be aware of rivals and potential rivals. Be aware of what's going on out there. The rivalry could be somebody else. It could be a substitute. It could be a new technology. Don't forget the importance of entrepreneurial insight and risk, and also don't forget the importance of luck. So hedge your bets, but don't forget that there's a huge element of luck that's involved in all this. So the next point I want to talk about is the possibility of improving value through diversification of activities. There can be value in diversifying. There can also be significant costs. So as always, your job is going to be engaging in a cost-benefit analysis. What are the pros and cons? What are the opportunity costs of diversification? So the pros of diversification can be obtaining economies of scope. So if you recall from the earlier lectures, your economies of scope and economies of scale are available. Economies of scale simply refer to a situation where your per unit cost of production goes down if you're producing on a huge scale. So for example, for McDonald's, they're producing so much, they've got the model down. It wouldn't make sense to have 1 or 2 McDonald's. It makes sense to have billions and billions served. Car industry is the same thing. Economies of scope simply refers to producing multiple related products at lower cost. So some examples of this might be, FedEx office or the UPS store. It's rather interesting to see that you can mail a letter there because they're postal service franchisees. You can mail UPS and you can mail FedEx. They also offer copying services because copying is usually related to mailing. They also offer notary services, one-stop shopping. I'm not really sure what notaries really do. I used to be one, but I just find it a little bit annoying to have somebody stamp. But anyway, Disney is a perfect example of this. Basically, all of Central Florida belongs to Disney, if you'll forgive the exaggeration. So Disney is not just the Magic Kingdom, and you go get to see the giant mouse and life is good, but they've got multiple parks. And then, market segmentation. How are we going to attract the adults? Epcot, Drink Around the World. Fantastic festival, by the way. And then once you're there, they might as well have you spend more money. So Disney runs its own hotels. It runs its own shuttles in between the parks. It runs its own restaurants. So Disney is able to obtain economies of scope in all these related products in the hospitality industry. Walmart is another example that I talked about. It's relatively cheap for Walmart to have a food section, a hardware section, a toy section, a clothing section, an electronics section. And they're able, even sometimes, Walmart has gotten in trouble over this. It's financial services. Some banks have tried to force Walmart out of the financial business because they're claiming that Walmart is basically acting as an unchartered bank. But you can cash checks at Walmart. I think there's some possibility where you can transfer money from one Walmart to another, like Western Union, at a lower cost. That's the kind of economies of scope that we're talking about. Wow. Comment from online. Disney runs its own version of Uber now with Minnie Mouse looking cars. Makes perfect sense, because if you're Disney and you're thinking about it, you've tapped pretty much everything that people can spend. Why not have one more? You're already housing them, you're feeding them. You might as well transport them in your own network. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, with the Walmart and the financing.
Yeah.
I see what banks are saying. They're not licensed with the same characteristics.
Mhm.
They also allow you, this makes me mad, they allow you to do things that other banks require you to have a membership to do.
Yeah.
It's like when I was working in a tip-based industry, I don't know if you're a member with USA Bank. You know how hard it is to get cash inside USA when there's no local deposits?
Oh, I know.
I give Walmart.
I'll repeat this in a second.
$500 for like $1, and other banks require that you are a member of that bank in order to do it. So I think that's going to be mad
Say
now.
employee credit union. You can use your card.
Well, I was living in the scheme where that shooter was from.
Oh.
No banks, like Wells Fargo, 2 other things. So there's no options, but Walmart is like the.
Yeah. So one of the services that Walmart offers is the ability to deposit cash for a small fee, even if you're not a member of the bank. So if you don't have a branch of your bank in your town, you can use Walmart. And that's where it gets fuzzy, because are they a bank or are they not a bank? And this is where the competition is going to try to shut them down. But again, if you can do one-stop shopping, that's going to make glasses services. Costco also offers glasses. Again, Sam's Club, one-stop shopping, a pharmacy. And so if you can find a way of offering related products and producing them at a lower cost and providing that to, you see that it's international conglomerates will do that, and I'll have a few other examples. The second thing related to this is promoting complements. The classic example is GMAC, the General Motors Financial. I'm not sure what GMAC stands for, actually, sorry. I just had it written down in my notes. General Motors realized that it could create its own, what was it, sorry? Auto Corporation or something. It's basically, General Motors figured out, instead of sending you to a bank to get a car loan, they could sell you the car and finance it in one fell swoop. So they're offering that complimentary service. It's easier for you to get a car loan. You're more likely to buy, so they're promoting compliments. PCs and printers and ink are another example of that, where they're going to try to promote compliments to have you buy more of the stuff, and this is economies of scope. There can be also acceptance. General Motors Acceptance Corporation. Ford does it also. However, with the benefits, there can also be costs. So the first one is diseconomies of scale. Firms can get too big and too bureaucratic. So there's a sweet spot. If you look at your textbook, there's that U-shaped curve of initially falling long run average cost, and then as the size gets bigger and bigger, it falls and then it increases. This is going to depend on the industry. So the car industry, as I pointed out, you're not going to get anywhere creating 300 cars a year. You have to create tens of thousands of cars to make it worthwhile. Other things, university education is an example. A school where I taught a few years back in Florida, Florida Gulf Coast University, started out with about 5,000 students, and one of its goals was to be a cutting-edge pedagogical innovator with encouraging professors in the 90s to incorporate technology in the classroom, novel techniques, etc. For a variety of reasons, ranging from the explosion in population in Southwest Florida over the past few years, to the pricing model, which made it more cost-effective for the university to have more students, to the bonus structure of the president. It went from 5,000 to 15,000 students in the span of about 10 years. And a lot of the old-timers who had started it said it changed the nature of the university completely, because class sizes went from 20 to 90. So you'd have 90 students in an auditorium, sometimes half of them failing the class because they weren't ready for that. And it went from a cutting-edge, small, nimble university to a very bureaucratic institution because it got too big too quickly. It got diseconomies of scale. Too many programs, too many students, etc. There was a clothing store, Britches of Georgetown, which is a little bit like Joseph A. Bank, went out of business when it was purchased by a big corporation because they thought they would get economies of scope and scale, but what turned out is it went from being kind of your neighborhood-friendly men's clothing store to a big bureaucracy, and it lost that personalized touch. This economies of scope is a similar process, except it's not a question of size, it's a question of focus. So Walmart can have economies of scope by providing food next to its clothing, next to its toys, next to the financial services, but a firm can get distracted by trying to offer too much because it loses sight of its core mission and opportunity cost. So McDonald's tried for a while in the 2000s to branch out into different kinds of foods, and then they realized that it was losing track of its mission. In think tanks, we always had this problem. When I worked in the nonprofit sector, you'd asked earlier, whenever a donation was dangled in front of us, the reflex was to go ahead and grab the money and then run the program that the donor wanted. But the problem is there was an opportunity cost to that, and a lot of times you would find that you were doing something that was outside your focus. So one example would be I remember this case, a women's shelter was offered $10 million to try to do an educational campaign and influence legislation. And the president said, no, that's nice, it's a lot of money, but it's not what we do. We offer services to women who are in need of a shelter. If we do that kind of thing, it could make our mission easier, but it's going to distract us from doing what we do. We're going to have to take away staff for it. And so it's a temptation sometimes to jump onto the next project just because it's there, but it's also important to know when to say no because you could get distracted. I remember once also Delta Airlines. I love Delta Airlines. We're talking about reputation and whatnot. I fly 80 or 100,000 miles a year on Delta Airlines. They take great care of me. They're delayed sometimes. Yeah, it's called weather. It's called air traffic control. It's called mechanical problems. And I forget who said I would rather be down here wishing I were up there than up there wishing I were down here. But occasionally they have delays. And I remember once my flight was delayed. I had to run halfway across the airport to get to the other flight. And that other flight was delayed. We finally get on, and they start with a 5-minute spiel about how Delta Airlines has partnered with, I think it was the Susan Komen Cancer Foundation. And I'm thinking to myself, that's a worthy cause, but that's not what you do. You fly planes. So and I know somebody smarter than I am thought about the positive benefits of the advertising of the partnership. There's probably a tax deduction. But at the same time, it's a distraction from the core mission of what Delta is doing. And it might be better simply for Delta just to make a cash donation if the investors are okay with it, rather than focusing its employee efforts, having the flight attendants wear pink uniforms. It's a distraction from their core function. Now, I'm sure they thought about that in terms of the cost-benefit analysis. but you'll see that there can be cases where companies will just simply get distracted away from their core mission because they're excited about trying something different. And it's going to be hard for you as managers to say no. So here's a potential profit line. It's an exciting product. What's the cost going to be? What's the opportunity cost of your time, your company's time before you accept it?
I guess you think too when companies get overzealous or over eager about taking on social responsibility.
Yeah.
That being distracted.
Social responsibility is a tricky one because I'm always tempted, this is the economist in me asking, are companies engaged in social responsibility because they think it's the right thing, or is it basically just one more advertising ploy? And if it's marketing, great, that's what they do. But there's also some concern maybe that it's taking away from their core function, exactly diseconomies of scope, and that maybe what a company ought to be doing is simply focus on what it's doing and then either make a donation or provide a cheaper product to consumers and higher returns to investors so investors can make donations and consumers have more money. It's a trade-off. It's always going to be a trade-off. So are you going to get economies of scope or diseconomies? That's the question you're going to have to ask. And then we'll have a whole unit of 4 lectures on this about human resources and organizational architecture questions. It's always going to be tricky when you have multiple different activities, when you're trying to diversify, getting the cultures blended. If you acquire another company, what are the different corporate cultures going to be? Do people wear coats and ties to work every day? Do they dress casually? Is it an 8 to 5 organization with X number of days of vacation per year, and then you're trying to acquire a company that has no vacation policy because you just take whatever vacation you want, you can work from home? That's going to be tricky. What are the management styles of the CEOs? Is one a very centralized CEO, whereas the other one delegates a lot? Does one like to spend a lot on investment and keeping workers happy? Is the other one more tight-fisted and looking at the bottom line? Those are the kinds of things to think about if you're diversifying by acquiring another company. So this brings us to the diversification questions for managers. It seems pretty basic. Don't diversify just to decrease market volatility. So when you have a stock portfolio, yes, you want to diversify. And you want to make sure that if the stock market takes a hit, you're covered in the bond market. If the international market takes a hit, you're covered with domestic exposure. You've got a balance of large and small companies. Those are the kinds of things in the stock market you want to do. But companies should not do that, should not diversify their activities just to decrease volatility, because diversification has costs, and the shareholders can already diversify through their own portfolio anyway. So this brings us to 2 kinds of diversification, related and unrelated. It's kind of obvious, right? Related products, so Walmart and consumer goods. So whether it's food or clothing, it's stuff that these are basic consumer goods. Unrelated products would be things like, well, you tell me if they're related. One of the luxury conglomerates is LVMH, Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy. So they have luxury bags, they have luxury champagne, they have luxury drinks. They're all in the luxury market. So that's kind of related, but also what does champagne have to do with luggage? Unrelated. So would you consider that to be a related or an unrelated diversification?
Related in the sense that luxury products are going
Yeah. So related to the extent that they're all luxury goods and the market's going to respond in the same way to luxury goods. Okay. Did you say unrelated?
You said unrelated when you don't have the money.
Unrelated when you don't have the money. Yeah, that's true. So that's something for you to think about. So there might be a logic to it. Disney is a perfect example of related diversification. Philips Electronics, the Dutch company, is another example. Now, they do everything from toasters to hi-fis, but it's all electronics and consumer products. One interesting one you may want to look at if you have the time. Haha, right? You're all very busy. But the Virgin Group, Richard Branson. It's an airline, multiple airlines. There's Virgin Atlantic, there's Virgin Australia, there's Virgin Media Group, Virgin Holidays, Virgin Financial. They even tried to launch a Virgin Cola, which failed as a competitor to Coca-Cola and Pepsi. They do seem to be working pretty well as an unrelated diversification case study. Typically, what you find, though, is that related diversification is more likely to gain economies of scope, and unrelated diversification is going to be more dangerous. because you're scattered in different directions. Now, maybe it's a question of the entrepreneurial insight and the energy of Richard Branson. He likes to have a hand in everything. He might be able to get the right talent. He might have the right kind of team that he can go in and find different kinds of people to run that. But typically, related diversification is going to work better for promoting economies of scope and promoting competence. So this brings us back full circle to our strategy. We've looked at this. You need basically as a manager to be aware of your internal resources and capabilities and what you can do. Be constantly thinking of how to do things better, hiring better talent, acquiring better processes, better machines, but also better internal organization. How do you motivate your people? How do you cut bureaucracy? How do you empower your workers to bring the best out of them? And we'll look at that. And then if you look at your business environment, you have to be aware of it because you're largely not going to be able to affect it except on certain small margins. But you need to be aware of what's going on, put all that together to formulate your strategy and the organizational architecture that you're going to use to formulate it. So you need basically a lot of this understanding the internal and the external, and keeping in mind that vision and skill are important, but so is luck. And keep in mind also that normal economic profits are zero, and they're called normal for a reason. So in the last 5 minutes, I want to bring this to a slightly different conclusion about your personal strategy. So I'm not going to have you, you know, that exercise. You're on a lifeboat. You have 5 most important things with you. What are they? So you list family, and you list independence, and you list free time. Okay, the lifeboat is small, so you need to throw one of those out. You can only keep 4. Now the seas are starting to get bad and choppy, so you have to throw one out. You can only have 3. What are the core values? That's an interesting exercise. I'm not going to make you do it in class, but something for you to think about. What are your values in life? What are your goals? What do you want? What's the environment within which you're working? That is, your dream may be to be a Shakespearean actor, but you might not be good enough to make a living at it. So maybe you want to do it on the side in community theater. Something to think about. Now, MBA's a different story. I have students who come to me and say, you know, economics was kind of fun, but I really want to be a history major. I want to be an English major. I want to get a PhD in English or history. What do you think? And I say, if that's your passion, go for it. But make sure you go to a good school and make sure you get good grades and make sure you work really hard because there aren't tons of jobs for historians and English professors. If that's your passion, do it. Society needs those kinds of people, those kinds of thinkers, and it's an important function. And if it's your passion, go for it. But don't expect that you're going to skate by on an English or history PhD and be able to get a job just like that. Be aware of your environment. Same thing with an MBA. What do you want to do with the MBA? So you have your MBA. What things did you specialize in? What contacts did you make? What people did you meet? What kind of industry do you want to work in? How much are you willing to work harder than your peers to get the job that you want? Or where's the balance for you? And all of that is going to help you formulate your strategy to develop yourself as a product. So just a few more minutes on this. Ask yourselves, what are your goals in life in the short term and the long term? Your goal in life may be to be a millionaire and retire by the age of 40. But your goal in life may be to have a satisfying life, to have a good work-life balance, work 40 hours a week and spend your weekends hunting and fishing or doing volunteer work or raising a family. What is most important for you? And applying the tools of economics, ask yourself, what is the opportunity cost and what are my priorities? And decide ahead of time. Rather than finding yourself and realizing, I just wasted the last 20 years of my life doing something I didn't want to do, I regret it. What are your internal capabilities? What strengths do you have? What are your weaknesses? What weaknesses can you get away with not developing? And this is something I look at all the time. And so again, part of my duties coming in December, if everything goes well, the General Assembly votes on my chair. My job is going to be to teach a class in the MBA program, to publish, and also to do outreach. And I'm already starting to see a lot of people are excited. There's a new person here. Why don't you come talk to our program? Would you like to volunteer for this, volunteer for that? I'm having to be careful because I want to be strategic about my choices. So there's some things that sound like a lot of fun. So for example, I met a week ago, I met somebody from the city of Fayetteville, and they've got a thing called the Citizens Academy, where you go in. Have you done that? Or?
I haven't done it,
okay.
But I know that.
you go in one night a month and they spend 4 hours on public works, and then the next month might be 4 hours with the fire department, 4 hours with the police department, 4 hours with city planning, 4 hours with budget. And the idea is eventually they get you to sit on commissions if you want to be a volunteer. Part of me is really excited about that. I'd like to know how a city operates. I'd like to know how it functions. And part of reaching out to the business community as the chair of capitalism and free enterprise would be to get to know people. It also seems like a really high time commitment. So I'm being careful about saying yes to too many things. And I'm just kind of watching and waiting, gathering information. But then I look at my internal capabilities. What do I need to develop to be a better teacher? What do I need to develop to be a better scholar? And this is where I'll be bringing you in at the end of the semester. It's the first time I've taught this class. I've been teaching for 12 years, but I'm under no illusion that my first time is going to be perfect. What should I do differently? More discussion board, more case studies. Would you like 2 chapters a week instead of 1 chapter per week? More homework if you were taking this again? Do you feel you're getting your value out of it versus the time you're putting into it? What do I need to think of? What books do I need to read? What workshops do I need to attend? And then think also, what's your comparative advantage? How can you work more efficiently at low opportunity cost and say no to certain things if you're not good at it? How can you stop doing things that are low opportunity? Can you hire an assistant for your next job? Can you hire a personal assistant if your company doesn't give you one, and is it worth it? Where might you invest in terms of having yard work outsourced, in terms of having house cleaning work outsourced, maybe even cooking outsourced? If you're working in a bank 60, 70 hours a week, you could find a healthy option. I forget what it's called, Blue Apron, I think it is, where the company will package for you a little bit like Lunchables, and here's an example of lowering consumer transaction cost. You're still cooking, but you open up the package and you have your 6 ounces of chicken and you have your vegetables and you have your spices, and it's all there for you, so you can save time on that unless you enjoy cooking. But this is something for you to think about as part of this class in this MDA. How can you apply economics to your own life to make yourself a better product? Are you particularly good with management systems? Would that be a good thing for you to pursue? Are you particularly good with understanding and reading regulation? Would it make sense for you to take either a 6-month boot camp or a 1-year LLM or Juris Master, so you can understand, not quite go to law school, but understand how the law works? Are you better with numbers and computers, or are you better with people and networking? What kinds of fields might you be good at? And what are your fears? So I can tell you this now. Up until the age of about 20, I was terrified of public speaking. Just did not want to do it. And what I did is I started forcing myself when I got to college, so maybe around the age of 17 or so. Every time I had a chance, I would speak in public. So I'd be at a party with friends and I would get up and thank the 20 people who were there. At family gatherings, I would get up and thank the people. And eventually I got over the fear. Now I'm not worried about it. But I knew that that's something that I needed to develop. And you can also just decide there's some things you're not good at. So unless they're crucial and you have to have them, like if you're not good at completing projects and deadlines, you may not want to be in an MBA. But you might also find that you thrive on routine. So you might want to work in a structured company where you're at your desk from 8 to 7 every day or 8 to 6 every day. Or you might think like me, I don't work well with routine. I work well with sitting down and focusing. So I'll get up in the morning and I'll work. And if I feel like working 6 hours, I'll work 6. And if I feel like working 3, I'll work 3 and then go do something else. And then I get a burst of inspiration on a Saturday morning. I will work all day Saturday. Tuesday rolls around and I'm just not feeling it because I've already worked 70 hours in the past week. I'm taking Tuesday off and going for a hike. So I look at myself, and I know this about myself. I'm better with looking at output rather than input. And I've done okay with that, but I'm aware of that. And I would not work well. I've been offered jobs in foundations in Washington, D.C. that would pay maybe twice as much as I'm making now, but I would have to wear a coat and tie, which is kind of okay. I could do that. I'm not going to whine, but it's still, I like not having to. But I would have to be at the office from 8 to 5 or 8 to 6 every day, and I'd have to work on somebody else's research. I like working on my own research, and I do well at that. But where do you thrive? What capability do you have? What are your external constraints? What are your family obligations? How much money do you need to make to pay off loans? How much money do you want to make? The law, Probably don't want to engage in illegal activity. It's not recommended. What is your health level? What is your energy? Are you going to be happy in a pressure cooker environment working in an investment bank 70 hours a week? Or are you going to be happier going home for lunch some days of the week and maybe going to your kids' recitals or maybe taking 3-day weekends occasionally because you're in a slower paced environment? Do you value a friendly work environment or a high octane work environment? What capabilities can you develop? What habits do you have? How often are you going to read books on management, on time management? Are you going to read the Wall Street Journal cover to cover every day? Are you going to read The Economist once a week? Are you going to read books on management? Are you going to take workshops to learn to be better? What opportunities are you going to seize? I think it was Henry Ford who said, most people miss opportunity because it's wearing overalls and it looks like work. And then fundamentally, what are your values? Because your life is going to be a vehicle for your values. So I'm going to leave it at that, but I think it's an important thing for a manager to think about because you are the most important product that you're bringing. Your skill set, but yourself. And you can develop capabilities, you can develop organizational capabilities, but perhaps the greatest investment that you can make, which is the investment you're making now, don't stop investing the day you get that piece of paper that says MBA. Continue investing, but then ask yourself where the balance is. How much time do you want to spend? Do you want to be that the crazy worker who's just working all the time because you love it and you want to advance and you want to build a company, you've got a vision, and you're spending evenings and weekends at the office trying to get a better product? Or do you want to have a better work-life balance? What is it that you want? And how are you going to get there? So these are some considerations for you in terms of looking at strategy and how economics, and especially the concept of cost-benefit analysis, but also the creation of value and that strategic thinking of where you see yourself and how you can add not just value to your firm and the product, but to yourselves. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording, take any questions that we might have.